All right, so welcome everyone. This is one of our online workshops that we've been doing since the pandemic. They've worked out pretty well, so I think we're probably going to be continuing these as the pandemic ends. So I'm just going to get right into it here. For starters, I just wanted to make everyone aware we have folks from various states and even different countries. I wanted to make it known that we are able to do this free workshop via Delaware River Watershed Initiative funds. This is the website if you're interested in that project. It's a William Penn Foundation project, and it's specifically focused in the Delaware River Basin, as you might guess. And just to point out, some of the products and resources that we're going to be talking about today are really more focused on folks that are working in the Delaware Basin. Certainly anyone is welcome to use those resources, but some of the products like the online field visit data entry, as well as a new service request form that we're making available to folks, are only really available for folks working in the Delaware River Basin. But really all the products are broadly accessible and usable wherever you are. So agenda. So we're going from 1 to 4 today. I'm going to start off here with laying out sort of some foundational stuff in terms of troubleshooting. I should be about 45 minutes. Then Rachel, who's a research engineer technician at the Stroud Center, is going to be getting into the meat of the troubleshooting content. And as I mentioned, as folks were entering the workshop here, Shannon Hicks, who is the designer of the Mayfly logger and the EnviroDIY monitoring stations, is also on the call today. And she is going to be available for questions and just expertise, and regardless of where we are in the workshop. We'll take a break about 2:30. That should be about when Rachel is a quarter or a third of the way into her presentation. So just a few housekeeping items. Anything that's not urgent in terms of questions, please just enter those into the chat. And the three of us, myself, Shannon, and Rachel, will answer those if we're able to right in the chat, or we'll hold them for later during the discussion period. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you're talking. For any urgent questions, feel free to unmute and speak up if you have any technical issues or whatever, any pressing questions. Since it's a workshop, we're asking folks to keep your video on. If you're uncomfortable being recorded or anything like that, feel free to turn your video off. And I'm sort of trying to deal with my video here. I think I'm just going to hide it all right now. And so the videos, well, actually, let me go back to this. We do have a resources page, which I'll introduce in a bit here, but this video will be posted there, as well as both the presentations that we'll be giving today. So just some introductions here. 3 of us participating today, leading the workshop: myself, Dave Bressler, Shannon Hicks, as I mentioned, is the research engineer, inventor of the Mayfly board and the EnviroDIY loggers. Rachel Johnson is a research engineer technician at the Stroud Center. Rachel does a lot of field work, a lot of troubleshooting. This picture here pretty much describes it. Hood up, head down, getting the work done. And then I don't think we have time to go through introductions for all attendees. I'm not sure where we're at on the numbers here of people that have entered the room, but we had 32 sign up, and most are from groups working within the Delaware Basin, but about a quarter, I think, are from outside the Delaware Basin. So getting into the workshop content, I'm going to go through sort of this foundational stuff that is really just kind of stuff that you ideally are going to know in order to be able to troubleshoot problems, having kind of this foundational knowledge. So I'm going to talk about the standard EnviroDIY monitoring station. You know, there you really just want to know the components. The data portal that we use, Monitor My Watershed. It's very important to know how to use it. Troubleshooting really starts at Monitor My Watershed. And I'm going to go through some standard recommended roles and responsibilities for ensuring proper station function. That basically means a recommendation of setting up a work plan with specific roles and responsibilities delineated among people. A main kind of theme that is going to be underlying all of this material that I discuss, as well as what Rachel is going to be discussing, is the use of Monitor My Watershed and quality control methods as sort of your foundation for troubleshooting, as well as just ensuring that the station is proper, that your stations are properly maintained. And then in support of this, I'm going to go through a case study at the end, which is based on a blog that we posted on EnviroDIY.org. Okay, so this is the page I wanted to introduce to folks. Some already know about this. I'm going to click into this quick and just review it briefly. Please feel free to go in there and take a look at it yourself in depth. But this first level is the field visit data entries right here, and then you can view all data entries here. And then you get the blank forms here. This is a tutorial, and then this is a discharge sheet that some folks use. Here within station help resources, this is the new troubleshooting request form that we have. Here's the manual. These are very useful quick guides here. This is the roles and responsibilities quick guide, and then there's a maintenance quick guide and a quality control quick guide. These are all for the standard EnviroDIY monitoring station, which has a Ctd sensor and a turbidity sensor. So those are the two main drop downs. Down here we have recorded workshops, meetings. We have monthly meetings every third Thursday of the month for folks working in the Delaware River Basin. Those are all recorded, so they're available here. And then like today's workshop will be posted under this tab here. Okay, so feel free to review that more thoroughly when you want.
Shannon just put the link for that in the chat.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you,
Anyone
Shannon.
who wants it.
Okay, so now I'm just going to go through what I laid out there as far as my goals for my presentation here. This is your standard EnviroDIY station. Logger box, solar panel mounted on a pole on the bank, wires leading down into the stream, sensor bundle with sensors in the stream on a rebar pole. Here's the logger box and what's inside it. So we have the battery, we have the cell board and the antenna, on-off switch, SD card. Here's where the sensors are connecting in via these Grove cables coming out the bottom and leading to the stream. Here's the Mayfly data logger, power switch, SD card socket. Here's where the upright SD card socket goes in for the stations that we're working with. This diagram is taken directly from EnviroDIY.org under the Mayfly tab. There's a lot of different materials at EnviroDIY.org. Feel free to peruse those. And then we have the cell board here. as I mentioned with the antenna, just a close-up view here. This antenna, this spot here can become disconnected. Rachel's going to get into sleuthing some of these issues, such as cell connectivity and stuff like that. This cell board has been kind of troublesome. It's a new thing that we put together in the last year or so, and Shannon has been working on a new cell board that is going to be presumably a lot higher functioning, and we have a few testers out of that. So hopefully that'll be available fairly soon, and we can get a little more reliable connectivity with these cell boards. So moving on to the standard EnviroDIY station sensor bundle. You can see here's the turbidity sensor, here's the Ctd sensor mounted to this PVC pipe with a hose clamp. You can see here in this photo the mounting pin, which allows the PVC to be positioned on that rebar and kept at a specific depth, most important for the pressure transducer depth measurements. You can also see here that there are zip ties holding the wires securely to this PVC pipe. You can see that you can adjust, if need be, you can adjust the level of the sensors using this adjustable hose clamp part here. And then here's just a kind of top-down view where you can see how this PVC mounts on top of this rebar, which is driven into the stream bottom. You get a clear picture here of the rebar pin, allowing these sensors to be removed from the stream if need be, and then positioned back in the stream at exactly the same level. And all this information about the stations is described in detail in the manual. So getting to the specific sensors that we use for this standard station, this is the Meter Hydros 21 Ctd sensor. There's a couple key features here. This white disc is the pressure transducer. It's a thin ceramic surface, and it is sensitive. Can be broken easily. So whenever you're cleaning the sensor or moving it around or doing anything with it, you really just want to be gentle to ensure that that thing doesn't crack or become damaged. These, you can see this also in this slot. You can see these screw heads, these 4 screw heads there are in there. That's where the conductivity is measured. So it's important when you're cleaning sensors to get your bristles of your brush in there to clean those off, because although conductivity is pretty stable, fouling can occur that can affect the conductivity readings, and I'll describe that more in the case study that I have. And then here's the turbidity sensor, the Campbell OBS 3 Plus turbidity sensor. This is a close-up of the eyeball that sends light out into the water column and measures how much is reflected back to give you a measure of turbidity in nephelometric turbidity units. This fouls very easily. It shoots a beam out 15 to 18 inches into the water column. And so anything that is in front of that, such as leaves or sticks or algae growth or sediment or whatever, is going to impair its ability to get accurate readings. So you have to really tend to these stations pretty diligently to ensure that you have good data coming in. Another key feature here of the standard station is the SD card. This is really where, as I say here, generally where the most where your data are going to be most secure. We do have we have had a few cases in which data make it to Monitor My Watershed but do not show up on the SD card. Those are very rare, and the vast majority of the time the most comprehensive data are going to be on this SD card. one quick troubleshooting thing to point out here is that this is pretty small, and sometimes you can get this card in there incorrectly. So you want to just make sure to get that inserted straight in there at a good right angle. Otherwise, it's not going to read your data. So the files from the SD card, as I mentioned, this is where your most secure data is going to be. A lot of data points coming in every 5 minutes, 8 variables. I think we calculated recently that over the 4 years that we've been doing this work with groups in the Delaware Basin, there have been 227 million data points collected. So regarding that SD card data, you can actually upload those data to Monitor My Watershed. If your station is offline or it is missing data points for whatever reason, you can upload those data files to Monitor My Watershed. A problem there is the upload limit right now on Monitor My Watershed is only about a week of data. So if you have large data files, you're going to have to break those up into smaller chunks. That is described in this help guide that you can find here at this page, and I'll demonstrate this page in a bit. So just something to be aware of with the SD card data and getting those data up to Monitor My Watershed. So now I'm going to go into some basic overview, a basic overview of Monitor My Watershed. So Monitor My Watershed is one of the Wiki Watershed tools, along with Model My Watershed, EnviroDIY, the LeafPack Network, macroinvertebrates.org, and the Water Quality app. And a new tool within the Wiki Watershed that is going to be posted here in the next couple weeks, I believe, is Manage My Watershed, where there's going to be stories and tools and question and answer forums. So feel free to check that out. So as I mentioned earlier, Monitor My Watershed really is usually where your troubleshooting starts, because that's where you're going to be viewing your data. That's where you're going to identify any problems with the data. That's where you're going to identify any strange fouling issues or technical problems. So this is your entry page into Monitor My Watershed. Usually I find it easiest to click Browse Sites, which will take you into this page. I'm just going to go back to here though and click into this and just show you how to navigate to the Monitor My Watershed help page. So if I click this link here, it takes us to that page that I just showed, Monitor My Watershed. And then to get to the help, you just click help, and it takes you to this page. And then you just scroll down to Monitor My Watershed and click View Help Resources. And what you have here is different links. Here's the link to the manual, to the Monitor My Watershed manual. It's kind of, as it says here, step-by-step instructions. And then we have a quick guide for usage of Monitor My Watershed. And here's that link to the process for uploading and filling data gaps. And here is a data patterns quick guide, just sort of a quick take on how to interpret data. And then this is a nice video playlist of different instructional videos for Monitor My Watershed, for using Monitor My Watershed. So feel free to make use of that. And then this is just a link to, I should mention there are curricula. There's a few lesson plans that we've developed around Monitor My Watershed. I'm working on an independent study template right now. And here's a link back to EnviroDIY for the Mayfly data logger. Let's go back to the presentation and next slide. So this is, once you click Browse Sites in Monitor My Watershed, this is where you come to. This is really just your first step in troubleshooting, where you're checking to see, is my station online? Dark green is going to indicate yes. Anything other than dark green is going to tell you no, it is not currently online. Now, some stations that don't have good cell coverage, you may get a light green for a period of time and then it'll go back to dark green. But pretty much if you see anything that's dark green and your station is online, it's going to be your first indication that something might not be right. The data panels, once you click on one of these sites, you click on these sites and then you can go into the main page for a site where you can view these panels or sparkline plots, as we sometimes call them. These will tell you the most recent reading for your station for all the different parameters that you're looking at. I just have electrical conductivity up here, but it has it for all those. And this is going to update every 5 minutes, giving you the current reading. It will be in Eastern Standard Time. It tells you that. You can see that by UTC -5. Eastern Standard is 5 hours different than UTC. We're in Eastern Daylight right now here in Eastern US. So it's actually, this is actually 1 hour, going to be 1 hour behind right now. These panels are really nice for working with when you're trying to check data when you're actually at the station. The time series analyst, which I'm going to show in a bit, doesn't work real well on smartphones, but these panels work really nice on smartphones. So you can very easily go into Monitor and check your data right on the spot and, check your QC readings and stuff like that. Okay, so the time series analyst within Monitor My Watershed is a great way to view past data and investigate trends for your troubleshooting attempts. In this plot here, just glancing at this, you can see we have turbidity here in the green and orange, and we have depth in the blue. You can see that turbidity has some weird patterns. It's not really going up when you have depth increases, which is pretty fishy. So, if you were troubleshooting this station, that would be a clue right there that there's some lack of response from the turbidity sensor to depth increases, indicating there's some issue with the turbidity sensor. So another example of sort of usage of Monitor My Watershed for tracking station function and troubleshooting and just managing your station is battery levels, keeping track of battery levels and seeing these types of patterns. So here we can see a decreasing trend. There's daily charging of battery levels, you can see, but it's a general downward trend. You can see it's approaching this 3.57 volts level at which stations will stop transmitting to Monitor My Watershed. So moving on, the recommendations for roles and responsibilities to ensure proper station function. This is a quick guide, presented as a quick guide in this resources page. And I'm just going to go through this, this quick guide here, give you an idea of what we recommend for managing these stations and setting up a good foundation for being able to keep the stations functioning and take care of any troubleshooting that needs to happen. So this quick guide is broken up into 4 different roles. There's a station manager or station owner, and that person's role, or several people's role maybe, is simply ensuring that the station is managed properly. And that means making sure that each of these responsibilities is fulfilled. So next role here is desktop monitoring of station functionality via Monitor My Watershed. So we, right now we have people who, one on this call, who their sole role in helping to keep a station functional is to just check Monitor My Watershed in the mornings and make sure that all the sites that that he is monitoring are performing correctly. And then there's the role of going out and doing weekly maintenance. So cleaning the sensor and doing basic upkeep of the station, clearing debris from around the loggers, clearing sediment from under and around the sensors, etc. And then quality control. You know, we recommend doing quality control cross-checks on a quarterly basis, but one important point to mention here in this troubleshooting workshop is that quality control should be done on a kind of a situational basis. So if you see something that looks weird, looks off, well, you know, a first step can be just cross-checking the data with a calibrated handheld meter. Go out to the site and see what another meter reads, and does it match up with your station? Okay, so maintenance and quality control, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those because we have quick guides for those, and you can access those via the resources page, also listed here. But I am going to go through a few things with regard to this roles and responsibilities sheet. So first, I just wanted to point out that Monitor My Watershed is kind of a key feature within each of these roles. So it's really quite important whether you're an owner or manager, whether you are monitoring the stations via Monitor My Watershed, whether you are cleaning stations or sensors, or whether you are doing quality control. You should be familiar with Monitor My Watershed, and you should be checking the data portal to see how the station is functioning so that you understand what your work, how your work at the station is influencing the readings, especially with regard to sensor cleaning and quality control. Okay, so I'm going to go through the three of these basic roles. So desktop monitoring, sensor cleaning, and conducting quality control. I'm just going to do it at a pretty superficial level, but it should give you a sense of what goes on with these. One point to mention here, though, is that all of these steps take time. It's easy to talk about this stuff, but it really does require time. And so in that way, you either need multiple people with some time available to do these activities, or you need just a few people with quite a bit of time. Either way, you know, managing a station, even though these stations are automated and online, they really do take quite a bit of maintenance and upkeep. So desktop monitoring of station functionality via Monitor My Watershed. Okay, here's your checklist, your basic checklist. Check sites of interest on a daily basis. We do recommend daily. You know, it's some people in the past, you know, don't check their station for weeks. And if you don't check it, then it might go offline and you may miss weeks of data because of it going offline, or if it goes offline, you don't know if it's still recording data to the SD card or if it's been entirely destroyed. So, first step here, this is just basics, and I already mentioned this, but go to the Browse Sites map and Monitor My Watershed and just simply check, is the station online or not? If it's not dark green, then you immediately know that there's an issue. Are the quick view data panels showing expected data ranges? So this is where it's important to really understand what you know, the station is measuring and what those ranges are supposed to be. So this is where it really is important to understand the ecology and understand, kind of calibrate yourself to what ranges are reasonable. So here we have water depth, and we're at 3,610 millimeters. So that's 3.5 meters. We're mostly working in streams that are fourth order or smaller. So, you know, you look at that and it's like, that's a red flag, right? Because it's outside of a normal range that you would see at most of these stations. Certainly during storms, if you see something like that during a storm and you understand your station and the stream, then maybe that makes sense. But you know, certainly checking the data in this way is good, proper practice. And then looking out for abnormal numbers. So not numbers that are sort of outside of expected ranges, but just numbers that are wacky and patterns that are wacky, that don't seem like they're sort of within the realm of the natural ecology patterns. So here, this is a common signal we get. Rachel's going to talk about this, but this is just a lack of communication between sensors and the logger. Negative numbers, for instance, another pattern that pops out sometimes that will signal some technical issue. So moving on to the other role within the quick guide for roles and responsibilities, sensor cleaning and station maintenance. Again, reviewing the station data on Monitor My Watershed before and after station maintenance is important so that you can understand what your cleaning of the sensors, what the response of the station was to that, and whether it did what you were hoping it would do. So again, looking at these sparkline plots can be very useful to figuring out and informing your station maintenance. So here we can see these are the 6 general spark lines that you will look at. And we can see here that most of these look normal. We have electrical conductivity, water depth seems normal, battery voltage is nice and high at 3.5, temperature is in a range that's normal. And then we get to turbidity and we see a negative number, negative 22. Ding, 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 red flag, red flag. So that's a sign that there's something going on here. Percent full scale of cell signal, 55% above 10%, so that looks good too. Another thing you can do in preparation for your station maintenance is looking at the time series analyst and investigating patterns that are happening before you're cleaning and then after. So in this case, we have depth in blue and turbidity in green and orange. There's 2 turbidity values. One's a sort of a low range, one's a high range. The high range just goes above 260 or so NTUs. The low range doesn't go above that. So, but they basically, if you're under 250, they match. Anyway, here we can see a lot of jagged peaks here. And you see there's not a whole lot going on in terms of depth. We do see a general rise, but there's a lot of stuff going on here that seems a little wacky and doesn't seem natural. And we get out here and depth comes down, but turbidity still remains kind of high. And then we see here a dramatic drop off. That's when someone went out and cleaned the station. So if you have fouling in your turbidity sensor, for instance, and you check and Monitor My Watershed, you're going to see that it's fouled. And then if you check afterwards, after you've cleaned the sensor, you can confirm that your cleaning did what it was supposed to do. Case study at the end is going to get into this in a little more detail. Then you can see once it was cleaned, it stayed nice and low and then had a good turbidity response to a storm that came through here, a small storm that came through here. So if you don't, for instance, in this turbidity example, if you don't clean the turbidity sensor, if this had just remained fouled, it would have come out here and you wouldn't have been able to detect this turbidity change here when the storm came through. So conducting quality control, very important in terms of troubleshooting. These are the basic steps to quality control. And I'll just briefly go through these, but these are all laid out in the quick guide and in the manual. So again, reviewing station data on Monitor My Watershed before and after conducting the QC. That is pretty much the same thing as what you're doing with sensor cleaning. QC, you are going to clean, when you're doing QC, you're going to do all the same things that you do in maintenance, including cleaning the sensors. So you obviously don't want to be doing quality control cross checks with dirty sensors. So for those cross checks, you're going to want to use a calibrated handheld meter to cross check station conductivity and temperature. Okay, so you're just going to go out there and take those readings right alongside your sensor, your station sensor, and you're going to make sure that the QC measurement that you take and the sensor station readings match up. Now, if they don't, we're sort of informally recommending to kind of shoot up a red flag if the difference between the QC and the sensor station is greater than 10%. If that's the case, then you want to proceed with troubleshooting and starting to think about really what the issues could be. Even simply thinking about, did I clean the sensor good enough? Did I clean the sensor well enough? I'll address that in this case study as well. If turbidity is a high priority, some people have turbidity out there, it's not super high priority. If you're really using the turbidity data pretty seriously, then you're going to want to do your cross checks whenever you actually are getting turbidity values that are higher than a 0 to 5 level at base flow. So you're going to want to go out during a storm and look at turbidity then and confirm that your quality control measurement is matching up with what the sensor station is reading. For depth, you're going to use a metric ruler to measure between the pressure transducer and the surface of the water. That should pretty closely match the depth measurement that is being read by the sensor station. We're also generally installing rebar pins on the stream bottom or staff gauges to cross-check sensors monitoring station depth as well, or to have as a, these rebar pins are a stable feature in the stream bottom. Those can serve as a benchmark if your sensors happen to get dislodged or something goes wrong with the depth. So you can put those back at the same depth and continue with that same depth reference. Another thing that's recommended in quality control is to swap the micro SD cards. So take the existing one out and replace with a blank one. This is, again, recommended on a quarterly basis or according to situational needs. The idea here is just to, since the data on the micro SD card is the most secure and the most complete generally, you kind of want to make sure that if something dramatic were to happen to the station, that you wouldn't lose a whole lot of data. If your station is not transmitting to Monitor My Watershed, then you're probably going to want to download the data from here much more frequently than on a quarterly basis, just to make sure that you don't lose data if anything were to happen to the station. So for folks that are working in the Delaware River Basin, we strongly recommend completing a field visit data sheet and entering the information into the online form. You can actually just fill the online form out directly out in the field if you want. It does function on a smartphone. Some folks like to fill out a hard copy first though, and then have that for their reference. And then, as I mentioned, this isn't a quality control workshop, so I'm not spending a whole lot of time on all of the details that go into this work. But we do have a quality control quick reference guide, and there is the full complete manual that you can reference to learn about how to conduct these quality control measurements. And quality control is a very important part of troubleshooting. It's something that everyone can do. If your station looks wrong, if the data look wrong, you can always go out and cross-check with a handheld meter to give you some bit of information as to whether data are looking proper or not. Okay, so let's see, how are we doing on time here? 1:44, okay, so I better keep moving. Okay, so this is the case study. Use of Monitor My Watershed and quality control as the foundation for troubleshooting. Okay, that's what I'm going to be emphasizing. That's essentially the theme of this blog entry, titled Increase Data Quality from Your Meter Hydros 21 Ctd Sensor with These Tips. Okay. So this is what we're looking at here, a situation in which a sensor is fouled and then it's cleaned and all of the data issues that may happen between this point and this point. Okay, so this was at a station on the Schuylkill River. It does have biofouling issues. There are a lot of algae accumulation and sediment in this region. So this is what the sensors looked like when we got there. So this is the Ctd sensor. This is the turbidity sensor. They hadn't been cleaned in about a month or so. And this is what the conductivity looked like before we got there, kind of focusing on conductivity for this example. This is actually, I didn't have the screenshot of that exact reading, so that's why this is blacked out, but it was a 329 conductivity measure before cleaning happened, okay? So per maintenance and quality control recommended methods, we cleaned the sensor. Okay, so here's what it looks like in the TSA. So we see that it's just sort of riding at 329 or thereabouts for a while prior to cleaning, okay? Per the maintenance and quality control methods, we cleaned the bodies of the sensors using the long white bristles of the brush, okay? So here's before cleaning, here's after cleaning with these long white bristles, okay? And then we went and looked at our smartphones at the conductivity reading. It went down to 314.8 after the cleaning, okay? Went down. But what we found, we cleaned the sensors and then we did our quality control measurement. You always do your quality control after cleaning the sensors. We went and did our quality control measurement and it read 380 microsiemens per centimeter. So 65.2 units different, 17% different between our quality control measure of 380 and the about 315 microsiemens per centimeter level of the Ctd sensor. So it went down with cleaning, but if the cleaning was going to help the sensor read accurately, you would have thought that it would have actually gone up so that it actually got closer to this QC measurement. But it actually went farther away from the QC reading. So we kind of thought about it a little bit and thought about, well, did we clean completely? Did we clean the sensor completely? And then we realized, well, it's been long enough that this sensor hasn't been cleaned that maybe the screw heads in the slot where the CTDs actually measured are fouled. And this was sort of a test case. We kind of knew that might be the case, but a lot of times people don't really get those bristles into that slot to clean those screw heads. So we went ahead and did that and got those screw heads cleaned off really clean. And then checked Monitor My Watershed again 5 minutes later, 1:15. Our initial reading was at 1:05. We cleaned the body and it was at 1:10. Now we're at 1:15 and we see it's gone up to 356.2. And you can see now it jumped up. So we cleaned the body and it went from here to here, and then we cleaned within the slot and got those screw heads clean and it went all the way up to here. Now they're only 23.8 units different, only 6% different. So that, I think, example really illustrates the importance of checking Monitor My Watershed and doing QC at the same time as a way to sleuth and troubleshoot problems. This is just sort of an introduction to basic concepts. Rachel's going to certainly get into more details of more specific issues. So one additional point here is simply that at times when folks are putting these stations out there themselves, they have been mounting the CTD sensor so that the screws are actually facing towards this rebar, towards the PVC. In those cases, you're obviously not going to be able to clean those screw heads properly. So, you know, that's just some sort of a quick example of how you really have to pay attention to the details of your station, understand these different parts and how they function to really ensure, that everything is functioning properly. Okay. So just a final statement here. The screw heads in your own CTD sensor may not need to be cleaned during every visit, particularly if sensors are being cleaned weekly or if there has not been significant accumulation of debris in and on the sensor. However, the only way to know whether further cleaning is needed is by making independent quality control measurements. Okay, so that really is a general concept as well as a direct application in this case study of using your own quality control measurements to start beginning to troubleshoot and sleuth problems. Yeah, so as I just said, this goes for all data from all sensors. Check the accuracy of sensor data using QC cross-checks with calibrated hand meters and equipment. You could say the same thing for doing depth measurements. Taking a ruler and just measuring from the pressure transducer to the water surface and checking if that actually matches with what the station is measuring. Okay, just a few final things here. We do have a new EnviroDIY service request form. Unfortunately, at this point, this is only available for groups working within the Delaware River Basin. Rachel's going to talk more about this. Maybe in years in the future, there will be a network of technical folks that can service stations, you know, across wherever, a broader range. Right now, this is only available directly from Stroud Center technicians, primarily Rachel and Shannon. So just one other thing here, this is all new stuff, new inventions, new technology, new guidance materials. So I like to present this sometimes to just let people know that we're really kind of in this sort of upward trend here. Shannon worked on these stations for years and years just internally at Stroud, using them for internal Stroud purposes. We're sort of in a public open source phase right now where these stations are available to the public to build and install. And, but we're still really, Monitor My Watershed is very new and it's kind of quirky. It needs to be built out, and that's going to be happening, on an ongoing basis as money becomes available. Shannon is updating station resources right now, working on a new Mayfly data logger. There are new CTD and turbidity sensors coming out soon, and as I mentioned, there's a new cell board coming out by Shannon. So that's what I have. We are at 1:53, so that's good. Rachel's contact information, Shannon's contact information. Krista Reeves works in the northern part of the Delaware Basin as a part-time Stroud tech. She can help groups in the northern part of the basin, and then myself. So I will stop share, and we can move on to Rachel, unless there are any immediate questions right now from folks. Any urgent questions at the moment?
Well, this isn't terribly urgent, but in one of your earlier slides, you showed the water probe in the water, and the wires are actually going back down towards the base of the stream and then over. I'm assuming it went straight to the bank then and up. Is that?
Yes, and that Rachel and Shannon, please chime in. But the idea there, Jesse, is just that you want to run those cords ideally on the stream bottom. So
that specific setup is when we mount sensors. If there's not a good location close to the bank, sometimes we have to put them farther out in the stream channel. So if it's kind of in the middle of the stream channel, which isn't ideal. We try to get the wires to go on the bottom so that they're not completely floating all the way to the bank. So ideally, if the sensors are mounted close to the stream bank, there's only a couple inches or maybe a foot of wire that's dangling in the water. Because sometimes routing them on the bottom, the way that those pictures showed, can add an extra tension on the wire. But if the sensors are mounted in the center of the stream, it's better than leaving them just flowing in the water that way.
Oh, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, of course. Are there any other questions before I share my screen and jump into my presentation? Nope. All right. Well, thank you, Dave. Your presentation was super thorough. Let's see, how do I? There we go. I was just hiding your faces so I could see my screen. I'm gonna touch on a lot of the topics that Dave already went over, but hopefully just add more information and maybe some more case studies, examples, and dive into the topics a little bit more. So there are a lot of different issues that can happen with these stations. And I just want to also first applaud you guys for showing up and trying to learn more about the troubleshooting aspects of these monitoring stations. I am, my role at Stroud is an engineer technician, but prior to Stroud, I didn't have much experience at all with water monitoring or especially this specific setup. So I gained all my expertise just by experience, by going out, looking at issues and trying to figure out how to fix them with the help of Shannon, of course. So if you don't consider yourself a troubleshooting expert, that's actually a good thing, because that means that your station is functioning properly and you haven't run into too many issues yet. So we're going to go over the most common issues that we tend to see across the board on some of our monitoring stations. And like I said, Dave did touch on a lot of the topics already, so this information won't be brand new, but hopefully I'll add some more details to these topics. So when thinking about how to go about this workshop, we wanted to narrow down the most common issues. And we kind of were able to umbrella the most common issues under 5 main categories. Being the monitoring station is offline, meaning the data aren't current on Monitor My Watershed. And kind of related to that, but separate in a way, is number 2, the loss of cell transmission. That is talking specifically about the Digi LTE 4G cellular board. So issues with that cell board will mean that your station is offline. So it kind of falls under the first topic, but there are so many subtleties with that cell board itself that we wanted to create a separate topic just for that cell board. And then we're going to go into various different sensor malfunctions or fouling and how those patterns show up on Monitor My Watershed. Kind of similar to what Dave was going over as well, but we'll add some more details and more examples of those different issues. And then the issue of seeing -9999 on Monitor My Watershed, which indicates a communication issue between the sensor and the Mayfly. And then we will go over various battery issues and battery voltage levels, what they mean, and how you can use that in your troubleshooting techniques. Before we jump into talking about each of those issues, I wanted to outline a general process that you should be able to follow no matter what the issue is. And sorry, my thing got a little wacky. Yes, so like Dave was mentioning, the very first step of troubleshooting is checking Monitor My Watershed daily. If you're checking Monitor My Watershed daily, you start to get attuned to the patterns of your specific station, what your normal depth looks like in base flow and in storm events, what your battery voltage likes to hang out around, what turbidity levels look like in base flow and storm events. The more you can pay attention to your specific station, the easier you'll be able to recognize when something's off. So really getting a good hang on what your station looks like under different conditions is extremely helpful to know when an issue arises. So if you do notice an issue by checking the data on Monitor My Watershed, then you're going to want to go to your station, go to the field, and further investigate. And when you do this, we suggest that you bring a few supplies that might help fix any of these issues. So this is just a general list that we put together. Later on in the presentation, I'm going to show you I think it's called a purchase options list that we put together that gives you the links to purchase all these different maintenance materials. But we recommend that you bring a charged battery, a spare micro SD memory card, a cleaning brush, and any QC supplies. I was just reading Carol's question here. Is there a benefit to changing a newly charged battery on a yearly or basis, even if the battery is not showing that it's declining? We can talk about that a little more when I get to the specific battery issues. I would say for the most part, if your battery isn't declining too much and your station's online, it's kind of that pretense of if it's not broken, don't fix it. Because sometimes if you go yanking wires, you can actually damage other parts of the Mayfly but we do have a whole battery section, so I'll address that later. Sorry, the blinking light just caught my attention. So having these supplies are super helpful when trying to figure out what's going on with your station. And by QC supplies, we just mean any extra handheld sensors that you may have, or a ruler to double check the depth. And we'll go into that a little bit more as well. And then a very easy first step when you're out in the at your station is to restart the Mayfly logger. Just like any other piece of technology, your phone or your computer, when it starts getting slow or acting up, what's the first thing that you usually do? You restart it, right? So this works very similarly, where it won't ever hurt the Mayfly to turn it off and back on again. So if things are acting funky, no matter what the issue is, it'll never hurt to restart the Mayfly logger. So we suggest that you do that. And then I have this general statement of if the issue can be fixed on the spot, do so. It seems simple and generic, but basically what I mean, like if it's a battery that needs to be replaced, or like I said, you restart the Mayfly and that fixes the issue, just see what you can do first before reaching out to Shannon, Dave Bressler, and I for any extra help. Because anything that you do to try to fix the issue in the field will be helpful information for us to further troubleshoot an issue if need be. And then if the issue needs replacement parts or any extra help, any extra troubleshooting from Stroud, this is mostly again for DRWI folks that Stroud directly support. You would fill out the troubleshooting request form that Dave went over. And then you would email Dave, myself, and Shannon with a copy of the memory card file that you retrieved from your station, if necessary. And then you would want to fill out your field visit data sheet and report all the different things that you did when visiting your station. So that's just a general process that you could follow. Believe this PowerPoint will be available to you guys. So if that's helpful, you can revisit this slide, but basically just keeping an eye on your data. If you notice an issue, go to your station to figure out what's going on, and then see if it's something you can fix, or maybe you need replacement parts or need extra guidance from Stroud, and then reporting what you did at your station through the field visit data sheet. So now we're going to jump into the different topics, the 5 different topics that I outlined before. Dave kind of touched on this a little bit, so I'll just revisit the information. If your station is offline, meaning the data are not live on Monitor My Watershed, like Dave mentioned, the first thing that you notice is, it's funny, we actually use the same example of the same station, but your dark green station dot turns any other color. That's your red flag to pay attention. Hey, my station hasn't reported data, at least within the last 6 hours. If it is yellow or red, then you got a bigger issue going on. You may be missing out on data. But I wanted to point out this really handy feature where if you click on this site, it pops up just this general information for your site, and it has a spot that says latest measurement. So before even going in and seeing what your data look like, you can see when it last reported. So that's really handy to know that that is there. And it could be offline for any number of reasons. Like Dave mentioned, if your battery voltage is below 3.5, it won't transmit to Monitor My Watershed. So that's shown as an example down here in this graph. This is battery voltage over time. And everything is, there's no really big charging upticks. It's kind of a downward trend. And then once you hit the 3.5 volts, it just dropped off and went offline. So that's the first thing that you want to check. If you notice that your station is not current online, you want to check your battery voltage. And then a second step to check would be going to your hologram data plan or your hologram dashboard to see if your data plan is current. So you log into your hologram account and you go to your specific plan, and you can see if your funds ran out or if it's still current. So you definitely want to make sure that that is paid before you make the trip to go out to your station, because if it's not, then everything could be functioning fine at your station, but there still won't be transmitting data to Monitor My Watershed. And I also just wanted to point out that sometimes the SIM cards, I don't know if you can see this, but the tiny little SIM cards that go into the cell board right at this part right here, those can actually fail sometimes. It's rarely happened, but we have had a handful of cases where those SIM cards go bad. So if you swap out everything else and your station's still not coming online, your data plan is paid, and you got a new cell board and replaced it, you know, you replaced everything and it's still not online, it is a possibility that the SIM card can fail. So just wanted to mention that, even though it's not a common issue, it is possible. But more importantly, what probably is the issue is that this cell board, this blue Digi cell board, has failed, because this is a board that we bought and we realized was pretty flaky. It didn't hold up for long periods of time. A lot of the boards were failing, and the manufacturer recognized that it was an issue as well. So they even replaced some of the boards for us. But they do tend to fail. And that is one of the main reasons why we're trying to shift to a brand new board that Shannon designed that is better for multiple reasons. But for right now, there are a lot of these blue Digi LTEB cell boards out there. So actually on my next slide, we can go into the details of that cell board a little bit more. But also wanted to mention that Monitor My Watershed, like Dave said, it is in development. It is a fairly new tool. So there are issues with the actual website itself sometimes. If this happens, you'll most likely recognize that it's not just your station that drops offline, but it's more of a widespread issue where maybe all of the stations drop offline, or sometimes, excuse me, maybe it won't even load the website. So that is a possibility. In those cases, usually we catch it pretty often because we do check Monitor My Watershed daily because we have a lot of these stations that we help support. So usually when this happens, if you're part of the DRWY group, you'll receive an email from Dave Bressler kind of letting you know what's going on and not to worry. And then the data will be on your micro SD card if Monitor My Watershed isn't functioning at the time. And then another thing that's not really part of the actual Mayfly setup, the cell coverage, your actual network coverage can drop or change. So sometimes there's network outages after major storms, just like power goes out at your house. And sometimes for whatever reason, cell towers, the coverage actually changes and you might not have a 4G signal, or some stations still are using 2G boards. The signal actually drops. So that's another reason why your station can go offline. But the most common problem that we're having lately is these cell boards. So here we have the Digi LTE-B attached to an EnviroDIY LTE adapter that Shannon created, and then the adapter plugs into the Mayfly. On the adapter, there are these 3 lights that can be used as a diagnostic tool for troubleshooting. Normally, you want all of these 3 lights to be off unless it's on a 5-minute interval where your station is turning on and taking a reading. So this white light you can see here, it's the power saying that the board is being powered. You can see it says on. So that light will come on, and then there's an orange light over here that's indicative of a signal strength. So it's kind of hard to tell, but the brighter the orange light is, the stronger your signal is. I personally have never been able to tell if it's brighter or weaker because you don't usually have 2 side by side. I just notice if it's on or off. But the main diagnostic tool that I want to point out is this blue light in the middle. So what will happen on every 5-minute interval, these lights will come on and the blue light will stay solid as it's searching for a signal. And then once it finds the signal, it'll start blinking, saying that it's transmitting your data online. So what you want to see are no lights, and then on the 5-minute interval, these lights come on, all 3 of them come on. Sometimes the orange one doesn't for whatever reason. That's why I really pay attention to just this blue light. But the blue light comes on, it stays solid, and then it blinks, telling you it's transmitting data, and then you want to pay attention that they all go back off. That's the main thing. So once all the lights go off, then you check Monitor My Watershed if you have a smartphone and see that the data actually sent. But sometimes these boards, when they start to fail, they won't power off, and all 3 of these lights will stay on and kind of get hung up. So data doesn't send, but these lights stay on. So if you go out to your station because you notice that your station dropped offline and it's not a 5-minute interval or shortly after one, and all of these lights are on, that's kind of showing you, okay, something's going on with my cell board. I probably need to restart my Mayfly. Sometimes you can fix it just by restarting it. This cell board does take a little while to power off. So If you turn off your Mayfly and these lights don't go off right away, that's okay, but hang around for a while until they do turn off, and then turn it on and see if that kind of breaks the cycle of it being hung up. But sometimes there's a bunch of different patterns that we've seen with these cell boards. And usually the fix to that is having to replace the actual board itself. But like I mentioned, first step is making sure that the cell plan is paid and up to date. And then in this case, you would want to swap out your micro SD memory card and check the data file to see, even though if my data aren't online, is the Mayfly still collecting data? If the data are current on the SD card, it's most likely a cell issue, a cell board issue. But if the data are not current, meaning the cell board isn't working, there's no data on Monitor My Watershed, and there's no data on your memory card, then that can indicate another issue, whether it's a battery issue or maybe even an issue with the Mayfly itself, or sometimes we've even seen the memory cards for whatever reason fail. So if your data are current, it's most likely a cell board issue. If they're not, then that shows you something else is going on and you need to do a little bit more digging. So yeah, I talked about the light patterns. That's what this is saying here, just explaining what I just said about the light patterns. It's a super minimal detail. I don't know if anyone would realize, but some of the LTE adapters that we have out there say status here instead of association. The newer boards that we have say, or ASSOC, whatever that stands for. So the RSSI stands for Received Signal Strength Indicator, and then the blue light is just showing your connection. And then again, you have your power light. So I know there was a lot of information about the cell board stuff, and we do have a lot of those failures out there. So I can't, oh, there we go, we'll go back. Are there any questions about cell issues before we move on?
Rachel, this is Dave. Maybe would you mind just mentioning a little, I mentioned it briefly, but would you mind mentioning about the antenna and about the sensitivity of that kind of
Yeah.
being detached and reattaching it?
Yeah, good point. So you can see here in this picture pretty well, it says cell right next to this little jack on the actual cell board. So that's where the antenna attaches to. You don't want to put it on this other side or it won't work. But they can pop off fairly easily. I don't know if I hold this up, if you'll be able to see it, but all that's connecting is that tiny little attachment on the antenna. And they tend to be really sensitive if you're taking it off and putting it on multiple times. That can actually break the cell board or the antenna itself. So when you're putting it on, usually most of the time, Stroud, for the DRWI stations, we will already have this on, and as long as you don't accidentally knock into it, it's pretty sturdy. It won't pop off too easily. I don't know if you can really see that, probably not, but it just attaches right on that little adapter right there. So if your data aren't live, you might want to check that spot right there that says cell, just making sure that the antenna has a good connection. It doesn't look like half of it is popped off, or, you know, maybe it even fell off accidentally when you were turning your logger on and off. Usually we have it tucked in the side of the board so it doesn't really get in your way. But like this picture is showing here, which I think I fixed this before I shut the door. But if this wire is in the way at all, it could pop off of the cell board, and then you wouldn't have a connection to send your data online. So that is a potential issue of the cell board. Something to check, just make sure that the antenna is attached properly. Thank you for pointing that out, Dave. So if there are no other questions about that, we can move on to the sensor side of things. And particularly how to diagnose issues on Monitor My Watershed. And then when you're in the field, kind of what you can do to see if it's a failing sensor or a fouled sensor. And then talking again about these quality control checks, making sure that you're checking with a handheld meter if you have that available to you to see if the handheld meter is in range with your sensor station sensor readings. And it can be really tricky looking at Monitor My Watershed to tell if it's a failing sensor or a fouled sensor. So if you see something, anything out of range, your first step is to go out to your site, clean your sensors, and see what's going on a little bit more. And then if the sensor readings are still fouled or reading funky after the cleaning, it may indicate that there's something going on with the sensor itself. There's so many different issues with sensors. They can get buried, like in this picture showing here. There's biofouling, like Dave was talking about in that case study. There's also debris fouling, meaning leaves and sticks, stuff like that, getting caught up on the sensors. And then there's what I've been calling a chemical reaction fouling. There's this fouling that we've seen throughout the Delaware River watershed, where this black film covers a turbidity sensor and you can't clean it off with a scrub brush. It actually takes Stroud coming out with oxalic acid to clean this material off of the sensor. So if your turbidity sensor is being funky, something you can check is looking to see that this eyeball of the sensor is clear and not being blocked by any sort of fouling, whether it's biofouling or any sort of film covering it. So just another review of the Ctd sensor itself. Dave was going over this, but I like this diagram a lot because it gives you an internal view of what the sensor looks like, where normally you can just see that black body of the sensor. So you have here your 4 conductivity screws, and then this is that white disc, the pressure transducer. And then on the internal circuit board, way up in the sensor body, that is what's measuring, this little chip here is measuring the temperature. So I wanted to mention that because if you had a situation like this, where your sensors were out of the water, or maybe the water level was right where my mouse is here, where you're still getting proper depth readings, but the sun is hitting the sensor body, that can throw off and foul your temperature readings. So we don't talk often about temperature fouling. It tends to be one of the more stable parts of the Ctd sensor, but if your sensor is not fully submerged, those temperature readings can get thrown off because the sun beating on a black sensor body, it can warm up, especially in the summer months. And then I wanted to just mention this vent again, because this is the part that compensates for atmospheric pressure. So if it's bent or broken in any way, then that'll throw off your depth readings as well. So these are the main parts of the Ctd sensor that you want to be aware of. And then this is the connector that plugs into this headphone jack that then plugs into the Mayfly. And this is just reiterating Dave's points. I'm using the same exact case study that he mentioned, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But just indicating the importance of cleaning those conductivity screws. We've actually seen conductivity, like biofouling, affecting not only conductivity measurements, but also depth measurements. So we've had situations where, just like this, where we noticed that the handheld meter we were taking measurements on weren't matching up with the conductivity. So we cleaned the screws, and then we actually saw a change in depth. And the depth was more accurate to what we were measuring with our ruler than before we cleaned the sensor. So not only does cleaning the sensor affect conductivity readings, but also the depth measurements as well. And I think that was, yeah, this is my mark for a break if we need one. So I guess before we take a break, are there any questions on anything that I've mentioned so far?
Hey, Rachel, you just mentioned that little jack that you held up.
Mhm.
I've been trying to get one of those, but it says that you guys are out. Is there any place that we can order those, or do you know the status of that?
That sounds like a question for
Which,
Shannon.
yeah, which are you talking about, the headphone jack or the
The
screw
headphone
terminals?
jack, yeah.
Yeah, I guess the headphone jack, the one that she just held up.
I thought some of those were listed. Let me check our,
Were you looking on Amazon or on the EnviroDIY shop?
It was actually Amazon. Maybe I should go to the shop.
They may be available there. I don't want to speak before I know for sure, but
yeah, we do have some currently listed in our shop. So if you go to EnviroDIY.org, up in the upper right-hand corner, there up where the tabs are for the various drop downs, there's a shop page. And we have a few of our, well, pretty much all of our different products we offer there. It's been very hard to keep things in stock on Amazon lately because of, for about the last year, things take an incredibly long time for them to restock. So if we send in a bunch of stuff, sometimes it sells immediately and sometimes it takes a little while. But then if we have a big rush on orders, and we sell out of something, it takes sometimes 2, and for a while there was taking 3 months for them to restock items on Amazon. So it was a lot quicker and easier for us to just implement a sales channel on our website. So, but in order to make it viable in terms of, we didn't want to be selling a lot of just small one piece at a time things. So we have to sell them in 5-packs. So if you can buy a 5-pack of those headphone jacks right now. And we're actually going to be changing some of the items in the shop up in the next few months as a lot of these new products are coming online. The new turbidity sensors and some of the other sensors out there are going to require different screw terminals and different adapter boards and all that. So so as we run out of some of the current designs, we'll be replacing them with newer ones. So as things go in and out of stock, we're not abandoning any of these things, and we're not stopping sales of anything. It's just we're trying to keep up with the changing technology to make sure we're selling accessories and boards and things that work with all of the upcoming hardware. So it's kind of a game that I have to play with the manufacturers. Is as soon as they give me some info on what they're selling, then I have to design something that works with it, get it made, produced, and here, and then come up with a way to distribute to everybody. So it's kind of been an ongoing challenge the last few months, keeping track of everything. So we'll be updating everybody on all that as time goes. But yeah, for now, if things aren't on Amazon, people should definitely check our shop page.
Cool, thanks.
For those items. Yep.
Rachel, we have a question from Christine. What is the best way to clean the 4 screw heads with the brush while the sensor is still in the water and attached to the pole, or by removing the Ctd sensor from the stream? Great question, Christine, and there are some subtleties to that, and I'll let Rachel explain some of that.
Yeah, I think it somewhat depends on where your sensors are and your specific site, because some sensors are mounted super deep in the water column. So in that case, it might be really hard to reach your hand all the way down there and properly clean the screw heads without damaging the pressure transducer, because that's the main piece of cleaning the Ctd sensor. Is you want to be really careful not to accidentally poke that pressure transducer, because that will break the depth. So I personally like to remove the sensors so I can see what I'm doing. And I think I have I don't know if I have a brush in here. But it helps me if I can hold the sensor in my hand. That way I can get a proper angle, like on this picture that Dave had talked about, he's cleaning it in the water here, so it can be done, but just paying attention to the angle of the bristles, that they're pointing down and not up to, again, avoid damaging the pressure transducer. But I personally like to be able to see the progress. So being able to look in there and see the conductivity screws all gunked up, and then afterwards being able to see that they're clean. Another thing that's really helpful about removing the sensors is that sometimes you can just swish it around in the water, and that will be enough to clean off any of the stuff that's lingering in that little slot. By taking the whole thing and just swishing it back and forth a few times, you can knock loose sediment that's stuck in there, or just any extra, debris that's caught in that little slot. But I know it is difficult for some people to get that pin properly placed again. So yeah, it's kind of a matter of preference, I think. But ultimately, if you try cleaning it, if you don't feel comfortable removing the sensors and you clean it and the readings are matching up with your QC measurements, then that's awesome. So if that's more comfortable to you, then you can try that first. And then if it's still not matching up with your QC readings, maybe then remove the sensor and try to get it cleaned a little bit deeper.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, any other questions? Oh, it looks like James has a question. I understand that the Hydros Gen 2 doesn't have horizontal slots. How do you ensure they are cleaned? Good question. Shannon?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer anything about that, just because I am not authorized to say anything about that sensor from the meter group yet, because that sensor hasn't been released. I do have one here. I don't know if they'll be making any changes to the design that I have. So I'm going to wait until they make some announcement about that sensor, but it should be easy to clean the screws on that one. It will be easier to see them. The pressure transducer is in a different orientation and is going to be much more protected and harder to damage. There's probably still going to be some cleaning issues that we'll need to address with that new model, but for right now, I think things should be probably a little easier to maintain, and it'll be a little more rugged. The good news about the new Generation 2 sensors from Meter Group is that the cable that connects to the sensors, well, for one, it's black instead of red, so your station will blend into the environment a little better without having that bright red cable there. So that'll be kind of fun. But the bigger thing is that it'll have an integrated air tube inside the cable instead of using just the jacket of the cable to provide the atmospheric reference that Rachel mentioned earlier. So if you accidentally nick the jacket of the cable, or a mouse pokes a tiny hole in it, it's not going to immediately kill the sensor like it currently does. If something penetrates the internal tube inside the wire bundle, it's definitely going to cause a problem, but it should make the failures due to pinching or nicks in the cable a lot less common with this new version. So they don't have an estimate of when that new sensor will be out, but I'm hoping that sometime in the next few months they'll be announcing that that everybody will get one. But for right now, I don't see any issues with the design that we'll have to kind of warn everybody about in terms of cleaning and fouling of it.
Great. All right, so shall we take a, Rachel, what do you think? 7-minute break? 5-minute? How's everyone feeling? Anyone speak up if you feel like you need a shorter or longer break. All right, why don't we go with 7 minutes? So it is currently
There's a list of 13 here.
2:34. So why don't we just meet back here at 2:40?
Sounds good.
All right, so we'll continue Rachel's presentation at 2:40.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, may as well for now. Okay, so it is 2:40 now. Rachel's back. Hopefully everyone is back at this point. I guess we shall continue.
Keep on keeping on.
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. So we are going to get into some of the different patterns that you see on Monitor My Watershed. I'm going to point out some of the normal patterns for the various parameters, things that you want to be seeing, and then things that indicate an issue, damage, or fouling. Trying to, I guess, what's the word? Calibrate your brain to what normal conditions look like and what maybe a possible issue or fouling would look like on monitor. So here we have water depth, and we're looking at a normal, good depth pattern during base flow conditions. So if your stream is at base flow, you want to be seeing just kind of like a straight line, maybe some slight oscillations up and down, but no major changes for the most part. And in storm conditions, what you really want to be paying attention to is that the level that your depth was at prior to the storm, that it returns almost to that same level afterwards. Maybe not immediately. Some larger streams take multiple days or maybe even a couple weeks to return to a true base flow. But just basically that you're looking at the hydrograph here. It's a fairly flashy one. This is in Westchester, downstream of a wastewater treatment plant. So really what you're paying attention to is that it's a fairly smooth graph and that the level goes back to a similar depth. It doesn't have to be exact after the storm. And this is another of a same example, but a little bit more wide of a curve, not as flashy. So again, you have your base flow level. Here it's a little bit below 200, and that the storm here, it was a pretty major storm. It went up over a meter, and then that it comes back down with no major spikes or drops or anything like that. It's just pretty smooth hydrograph that comes down almost to the same base flow level. And again, this might take longer than a couple days. I'm sure if you didn't have any other rain events, it would get back down to that initial level after a few days or so. Now, on bigger river systems like the Schuylkill River, sometimes you'll see multiple inputs through a same storm, and it can last over multiple days. So here it's still a normal looking depth pattern where you had a base flow level of around 250 or so, and then we had some pretty major storms. And again, what you're looking for is that base flow level to return after the rain events stop. So it doesn't always have to be a super smooth graph for it to be a normal depth pattern. It depends on your system. But again, try to pay attention to your specific site and what your stream does during storm events, because these patterns will usually look fairly similar for each rain event. Like here you can see there's multiple inputs for each individual event where it doesn't just come up and down. And getting into specific depth issues, how to tell that your depth may be broken just by looking at Monitor My Watershed. So we have this depth and temperature correlation pattern. That's a major one to look out for. And then we have your depth being out of range, any dramatic changes in depth, either up or down. It could be positive or negative changes. And then fouling issues. So this is the main one that I want to point out because it's one of the most apparent issues where if you are having these increases of depth, even though there's no storm events going on, that's a major red flag. And the orange line here is temperature. So we have plotted over depth over temperature, and you can see that the peaks in the depth line up almost exactly with the peaks in temperature. So this is something that we see when the pressure transducer fails. It tends to kind of follow the temperature pattern. So if you're noticing that, again, your stream, there's been no rain in a week, but you have multiple increases of depth, try plotting temperature over it and seeing if it matches up. That's more than likely, I think in almost every situation we've checked that it indicates that a sensor has failed. And in this case, sometimes if it is still covered under a warranty, it can be replaced because it's not, like as long as the sensor cable doesn't have any nicks or damage to it, Meter Group will, I don't know if you have to buy the warranty separately, but I think for each sensor, there's at least a year warranty, where if it fails within a year, you can replace it and get a new one. But definitely keep an eye out for this pattern. And here is an example of the depth going negative. So it's kind of hard to see these graphs. It's hard to get them big enough to see, but we have a pretty stable base flow going on. And then this was a pretty big storm last year in 2020. I think it was one of those, I don't think it was a hurricane, but we had a few major storms where the depth actually went up way higher than this 1 meter. For this specific example, we actually had, the station owner had video footage of the depth. So we were able to see that the stream got way higher than what was reading on monitor, but it dropped out here and went negative. So you can see this is negative 500, and that indicates that the pressure transducer was damaged. So basically what happened was something, rock or big woody debris or something came along and whacked the sensor, and it broke and showed a negative pattern. And then this right here was when I went out and replaced the sensor. So usually, again, in these situations, the only way to fix it is by replacing the sensor. With the depth out of range, I wanted to point out this tiny little space that exists between this circuit board that holds the conductivity screws and the pressure transducer. Sometimes a perfectly tiny little sized particle or stick or any debris gets caught in this tiny space between the circuit board and the pressure transducer, and that can throw off your depth readings. It doesn't necessarily mean that the sensor is broken, but if you see any dramatic changes in depth, this is one thing that you can check before counting the sensor out as a broken sensor. You want to remove them from the stream, and I don't know if you noticed, but you can see in here so well because Shannon actually, this was a broken sensor that she cut off this piece so you can see really well into what it looks like inside the Ctd sensor. But normally this would be the bottom of the little slot, so you could still see in that space if you're looking into it. And you want to just make sure that nothing is jammed up in there because it'll throw off your depth readings. So a good way to do this is, again, by just swishing the sensor around fairly vigorously, being careful of the wire, but just swishing the sensor around in the water is usually enough to knock out any any junk that's stuck in that little slot. You don't really want to go poking anything in there because again, it can break the pressure transducer. So usually what I'll do is I'll look in that slot, swish it around the water, and then look again and just keep moving it back and forth in the water until all of anything that's stuck in there comes out. So if that were to happen, you could see a pattern like this, where this is a tiny little creek. It definitely did not get over 2 meters high. I don't even know if this was a rain event or not, but something happened here. This is a major red flag where the depth shot up dramatically. And then after that, the depth readings became unstable. They kind of hung on for a little while. If you zoomed in right here, I bet you could see more variation than what you're seeing on this graph that's zoomed out. But after a short amount of time, the values went negative. So that was a clear indicator that the sensor had been broken by whatever event happened right here. And again, just reiterating that the only way to really know if your depth is accurate or not is by doing a QC measurement. And the way that we do this is just by taking a hand measurement with a ruler. The one thing that you want to pay attention to is where your zero starts on your ruler. So the ones that we have actually have this little space that lines up perfectly with the CTD slot. So we're actually able to line up the bottom of the ruler with the bottom of the CTD slot because the zero starts at the pressure transducer. So if you have a ruler that starts at 0, you want to put it at the top of the CTD slot where the pressure transducer sits. And then you'll measure from there to the top of the water surface. And here is just a picture of the field visit data sheet on where you would enter that value. And then right above it, there's a spot to write what the sensor reading was at that same time. So that's the best way to really check if your sensor reading is in the ballpark of an actual physical hand measurement. And there's also having a secondary check to QC is super important. So we have 2 different variations that we've been using. We initially started using these staff gauges, but we found out that they don't really hold up in all systems. They tend to hold up better in smaller systems, and they're nice because they have these clear numbered marks that are easy to read, but they kept getting washed out. So we moved to this style of QC check, which is just hammering in another rebar. That's the same rebar that this sensor bundle is mounted on. You just hammer in another one, and then what you do is you measure from the top of this rebar to the top of the water surface. And then once you have those values, you can get an offset from your secondary check to the sensor reading. So what you would do is take your staff gauge height or that rebar measurement and subtract the sensor station depth to get an offset number. And as long as that offset stays the same, you know that nothing major has changed within your sensor, whether it was the sensor got moved or damaged in any way. What you mainly want to be checking that this offset number doesn't change dramatically. It stays around the same. So that was the CTD sensor. Now we'll get into a little bit of turbidity sensor fouling. And this can be a tricky one. I think Dave gave a few examples in his presentation, but we found that when sensors get buried in dark, fine sediment, they actually show the same pattern on Monitor My Watershed as a failing sensor. So the main thing that I want to point out is if you see this flat line where there's, sorry, so the green line is turbidity, the blue is water depth. There's no turbidity response when the depth is increasing. So that's your red flag, something's going on there. It could either be a fouled sensor or your sensor could be damaged, broken. Either way, you're gonna have to go out to your site and check it out further. But this is the main pattern you wanna be looking out for, is there's rain events, there's depth increases, and no turbidity response. That's showing that something is going on. You can see here, there's a tiny red wire. That's a CTD sensor that's buried in about a foot of or more of sediment. And that happened in just one or a few storms. It didn't take a lot of time for that much sediment to bury the sensor. So something that you kind of have to keep on, especially if there's a lot of fine sandy sediments in your system, in your stream system. Another example of that same pattern, this is at the Schuylkill River. We have, depth increases and no response. So there's a few storms here, no response. And this was actually a situation where it's almost like quicksand. When you're standing in the river, you literally just keep sinking and sinking and sinking because there's so much fine sediment in this major system. So it was a tricky one to deal with. And we ended up having to actually raise the sensors up higher so they would be off of the stream bottom. So that's what you see right here. You see the depth decrease because I moved the sensors higher up in the water column. So there was less water that it was measuring. The depth decreases and you can start seeing a turbidity response again. So if you see this flat line, again, that's your red flag to go out and see what's going on. If there's no sediment burying your sensor and there's no fouling on that window, the way that I showed a few slides back, then that would indicate that possibly your turbidity sensor has died, because like Dave was mentioning, there's an infrared light that shoots out of the sensor. It's an optical backscatter sensor. So it shoots out a light and is measuring the particles that are reflected back. And for whatever reason, like the color or like the density, I guess, of the thing that's blocking it can affect the way that it shows up in its reading. So sometimes when it's fouled just with a bunch of leaves and stuff covering it, it'll read really, really high. But when that light starts to die, that diode starts to get weaker and weaker, the signal kind of stops responding. So you'll see that flat line if the sensor is breaking as well, which is kind of what you're seeing here in this example. So here you have some turbidity response with rain events, but then you can see here in these bigger rain events, the turbidity sensor doesn't respond as strongly as it did here. And maybe the sensors were fouled here, who knows? But this particular group does clean their sensors often. And I noticed that looking back at the pattern, the response gets weaker and weaker until it kind of flatlines here. And then unfortunately, this was a cell board issue where it dropped out. So ignore this piece in here. But when it came back online, the values were negative. So usually negative turbidity values are showing that something's wrong with the turbidity sensor. We haven't usually seen super negative values just from fouling. It's usually saying that something's going on with the sensor. And then another thing that I wanted to mention with the turbidity sensor is that even if there's no sensor connected, it will still give out readings. So here, these readings are from when you can see there's no turbidity sensor connected through a Grove cable. There's nothing connecting this wire to the Mayfly at all. But these readings were when there was a connection there. And the high range will read around 250 and the low range will read around 50 or 60 NTU if there's nothing connected to it. So it's tricky because you may think that your sensor is just fouled and something's covering it, but in reality, someone has come along and cut your wire, or an animal chewed your wire through, or something got disconnected. So it can be really tricky. Either way, if you saw these 50 and 250 numbers, you would want to go out and clean your sensor. So that would at least get you out to the field to notice, hey, something worse actually went on. But I wanted to mention that it still gives these readings even if nothing's connected to it. So again, the turbidity sensor is a little bit tricky to troubleshoot just using Monitor My Watershed. You really need to get your feet on the ground and go out to your station and see what's going on if there's wacky turbidity fouling or failing of sensors.
Rachel, this is Dave. With regard to those two turbidity readings there, since they're both under 250 or 260, then in a situation where they were functioning normally, those numbers would be pretty close to one another within a couple units. Is the difference between the high range and the low range another red flag there?
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. But yeah, definitely. Especially because I think the low range is more accurate under 250 NTU. I think
Right.
that's the threshold. So yeah, that's a really good point. And that's another thing that I actually didn't put into this presentation, but is really important to pay attention to, is that varying level. If your turbidity units are under 250, both of the signals, the high and the low range, should be fairly similar, maybe within a few NTU. But if there's major differences between them, then that can show that something's going on within the turbidity sensor itself where it might be malfunctioning. So I'm glad you brought that up. Are there any questions about Ctd sensor or turbidity sensor, fouling, failing, anything that we just covered before we move on?
I have one quick question, and I don't know if it's entirely relevant because I don't know if you use self-cleaning turbidity sensors in your work. But is there an obvious sign for when the O-ring seal around the self-cleaning brush breaks down and allows or causes electrical damage when water enters the probe?
Yeah, we don't use those sensors too often, but I think Shannon has some experience using self-cleaning turbidity sensors. She might be able to answer that.
Yeah, the only self-cleaning ones that we've used in the past were, we've got a few that are also made by Campbell Scientific, but they are about $5,000. So they're about 5 times more expensive than the current OBS3 that everyone is using in the stations who's attending today. There are some of those Yosemite sensors that have the motor. Is that are you using Yosemite ones?
That's correct. Yeah, we're using Yosemite.
Yeah, I haven't used them enough to know when that failure would occur. So that would be something you'd need to, I guess, talk to the manufacturer about that. We've deployed a few just for testing, but we haven't done any long-term deployments of those. So I haven't seen one go bad yet. But yeah, they probably have some sort of recommended maintenance on that. But I don't know if that's something the user can do or if you would have to return it to them to perform that maintenance. So yeah, we check with them on that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Any other questions?
Adam has a question which I'm answering in the chat. Adam, feel free to bring this up again when we're in discussion if need be.
Sure, thanks.
Okay. Did you want me to read that question, or you're muted? But I think you said no.
Sorry, Rachel.
That's
I
okay.
I don't even know where I was muted there. I'll answer it in the chat, and then Adam can follow up with questions.
Awesome.
Discussion if need be. Sorry.
Sounds good. Yeah, we should have some decent time to talk about various things in depth after this presentation. We're almost through, so hang in there.
Cool.
So the fourth major issue is this negative 9999 communication issue. And it could be happening for any number of reasons, but the main thing that you want to think when you see negative 9999 is that it's not connecting to the Mayfly. So we've seen bad headphone jacks, the thing that we were talking about before, this connector that Shannon created. Sometimes the connection in these, if water gets into the waterproof box, over time, the circuit board can corrode and it needs to be replaced. Sometimes it can be as simple as that to get your sensor, your CTD sensor connecting again. So we always try when we're troubleshooting to replace the cheapest parts first. You know, we think of all the possible things that could be wrong and then replace the cheaper parts first, hoping that they fix it, and then kind of work our way to the more expensive stuff. So it could be a bad headphone jack. It could be a Grove cable problem, even if it's not properly plugged into the Mayfly with a good connection. Like you might think that, you see, there we go. You might think that this is properly connected, but if it's just pulled out a little too far, then it won't read properly. So a good thing to try if your CTD, all three parameters are reading negative 9999, is to disconnect your Grove cable and try to plug it back in. See if that works first. Otherwise, try swapping this out, because that's another cheaper part than a $500-something sensor. So it's easier to swap out these cheaper couple dollar pieces than it is to get a whole new sensor. This pattern also shows up if the sensor wire gets damaged or cut. So here we have a mouse or a squirrel that got a little too hungry, and something about these wires, they seem enticing for small rodents. So here it chewed through and it had that negative 9999 show up because of that. And I don't know if I'm remembering correctly, Shannon, is if the cable gets nicked like this, will temperature still have readings, or is it just, will all three go out at once?
Well, it depends. The minus 9999 is currently for the CTD sensor. It is generated by the Mayfly itself. So if the Mayfly can't, when it goes to talk to the sensor, if it doesn't hear anything, it will report that number. But with the new sensor or the new CTD or some of the other sensors, if that sensor actually reported some drastically high number or extremely negative, weird, strange number, then the Mayfly will also, instead of reporting like minus 5,000, it actually might say minus 9999. Or if the sensor was malfunctioning and said 10 million for some value, the Mayfly would then overwrite that with this number. So but sometimes with the newer sensors, the sensor themselves actually generate this number. So it basically just indicates that there's something wrong. But yeah, for the most part, I believe we've only, with the CTD sensor that's currently out there, usually if one parameter says that, then all three of them will. So they tend to all go bad all at once.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And what Shannon was just saying was this bullet point here, where the sensor reading is out of expected sensor output range, the Mayfly will report these numbers. So that kind of took care of that bullet there. Or sometimes the internal circuit board of the sensor will fail and give these readings. So if you see this pattern, you want to go out to your station. Again, it's like that thing. You see an issue, you go out and check it out. You go out to your station, and if you don't see any major damage to the wire, that's the first thing that I would check. Run all the way along the length of the cable from your logger box to the stream. And sometimes it's not as apparent as being snapped in half or this major chewing. Sometimes it's just a tiny little nick, maybe like a deer stepped over it too many times. Who knows what could have caused it, but just check the length of the wire, because even a tiny small little mark could give these fouled readings. It doesn't have to be fully split in half, which is one of the downfalls of the old model of the Ctd sensor. So hopefully the new generation will hold up a little bit better in that regard. But here are just some more pictures of mice chewing or squirrels chewing the sensor wires. And then something you can do to prevent that is running your sensor cable through a metal conduit, because usually they won't be able to climb up this pole. Sometimes maybe they would, I don't know. But if you make it hard for them to get to your wire, you have a better chance of it standing up against the little critters. So this is some things that we do. We usually carry this with us when we're installing stations, and if we notice there's a lot of squirrels in the area, or we see like a little mouse right where we put the sensor or something, we'll put this metal conduit around it. But usually also, if a sensor gets damaged in this way, when we replace the sensor, we'll try to protect it so that it doesn't happen again. So with that being said, I guess we'll just go right on and talk about the last major common problem that we have, which are battery issues or battery voltage levels. So we're going to review what proper battery levels look like, how to interpret what a battery voltage means. When you're looking at a number on Monitor My Watershed, what does that mean? We'll review how to replace batteries. We'll look at a few different patterns of good versus bad charging patterns. And I wanted to mention before we start talking about battery issues that there are a lot of different pieces that can affect the battery, such as the sensors, the cell board, like we talked about, the solar panel. These external parts that we buy and attach to the Mayfly can cause an interference that drains batteries. So batteries themselves can actually be a diagnostic tool, or the battery voltage patterns can be a diagnostic tool of other parts on the board that may be malfunctioning as well. And right here we have a picture of what it looks like with this battery charger that we have. You want to be really careful and only buy the recommended batteries that Stroud suggests, because of the polarity on the battery. A lot of the batteries that are commercially available have a backwards polarity from what's needed on the Mayfly. And if you hook that up or plug one of those batteries into this battery charger, it could blow up the Mayfly or the battery, start a fire, all sorts of bad things. So you want to be really careful if you're buying spare pieces to check what we suggest first. And we have this available in the online manual at EnviroDIY.org. But also I'm going to be going over in one of the last slides, we've put together a suggested purchase list of various different parts and pieces that might be helpful when you're troubleshooting your station. So we'll go through that as well. Just a brief overview of how this thing charges the battery. We have a solar panel that has a wire that runs down and in through a cable gland, waterproofing this box that sticks out the back of this box right here and plugs into the top left of the Mayfly when it's in this direction. So the solar panel plugs in right here, and then you have your battery plugging in right next to it. So the solar panel charges the battery, and the battery is what powers the Mayfly. So if any part of those pieces break, whether it's the wire or the solar panel, it can cause your Mayfly to stop taking readings. So this is the solar panel cable, like I was just explaining. The one thing that we've noticed to be aware of with these are that sometimes after being out for a few years, the cable starts to crack and break. So if you're out and you notice that your battery hasn't been charging, definitely look along this cable to make sure everything is connected and sealed properly. And then right here on the Mayfly is where the battery plugs into, right where it says LiPo bat. And then you can see in a little bit closer here where the solar panel wire would plug into. So going through battery voltages, this is kind of what I use as a diagnostic tool when I'm looking at battery voltages. If a station drops offline, or just if I'm looking at the patterns, if anything is 4 volts or above, it's a fully charged battery. There's no issues there. So if your station drops offline with 4 volts of battery level, you know that it's either the cell board or something else is going on, and it wasn't necessarily a battery issue. And again, in between 3.7 volts and 3.9 volts, that's perfectly fine. Those are voltage levels that are like the Mayfly is totally happy to be working with. So 3.7 is the nominal voltage, which is the default resting voltage of the battery pack. It's the middle ground between fully charged and the low voltage cutoff. So these batteries are super happy hanging around 3.7 volts. Anything 3.7 or above, you don't have to worry about. And again, if the station drops offline with 3.7 volts or above, it's showing you it's probably something else, a cell board or something else is going on, and it's not a battery issue. But when you start getting into this range of 3.5 to 3.7, you want to start looking at the pattern on Monitor My Watershed. Is my battery charging every day? Like, what's going on that's keeping it below a 3.7 volt? It's kind of, this range right here is your red flag. When you start seeing these values, you want to go in and look at the pattern to see what's going on a little bit deeper. And then, like we've mentioned many times, anything below 3.5, your data will not transmit to Monitor My Watershed. It may still be taking readings on the micro SD card. The Mayfly will still be functioning. But I don't know the exact cutoff of battery voltage when the Mayfly stops functioning as well, because when it gets low enough, the Mayfly will stop functioning. So this is really, if you didn't pay attention to what's going on in this range of 3.5 to 3.7, once it drops offline on Monitor My Watershed, then you want to go out and try to see what's going on. I wanted to mention this LED light that shines on the Mayfly board. This is the charging light. So when the solar panel is plugged in and the battery is plugged in, anytime the solar panel is charging the battery, this orange light will be on. The only time that that light will be off is one, if the battery is fully charged and it's not being charged currently. So in that case, if your station was online and everything was working fine, and you were out at your station doing QC or whatever, and that light was off, then it's not an issue. But if your data were not live on monitor and you went out to your station and saw that this light was off, then that's a red flag. You want to be seeing this light if the battery is charging. Sometimes if these connectors don't get a good enough connection, you have to unplug it and replug it in for this charge light to come on. So if your battery is not fully charged, this light should be on. That's the bottom line. If it's not, you can try removing the battery and plugging it back in. You want the Mayfly board to be off anytime you unplug a battery. It's kind of like pulling out a USB drive from your computer without ejecting it first. It gives the possibility of corrupting your data file. So you want to make sure your Mayfly board is off before you unplug your battery or solar panel. But if the Mayfly board is off and then you unplug your battery and plug it back in, maybe this light will come back on. So that's kind of a troubleshooting tip that you can try. And now we'll get into some of the patterns. So here you can see there are daily upticks in charge. So this battery was being charged. It's just whatever the power draw was larger than the ability for the solar panel to charge the battery. So it has a downward trend constantly, even though it's still charging every day. It just can't quite keep up. This is a super forested station. So it's not surprising that this is happening. And then this here is someone going out and replacing the battery with a fully charged one. But again, you can see they had to keep going out because over time, the overall trend was just downward. So here the station, I don't think it dropped offline here. They just went out and replaced it because they saw it was getting to that lower range. But here the station probably actually dropped offline because it went down to around 3.5 or below. So then they replaced it and pattern continues. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that it's going to require attention. You're going to have to go out and swap your batteries continuously. Whereas this pattern, you can see there's no upticks. It's just a constant downward trend. And this is actually a station that we had to remove the solar panel. So there was no solar panel charging this station. But if you had a solar panel on your station and saw this pattern, it might show you that someone stole your solar panel or that wire broke and got disconnected. You would want to go out and see what was going on. And I also wanted to mention that these batteries can corrode if there's moisture getting into these Pelican cases. So the only reason we were able to see this pattern, usually it's blocked by this like outer plastic layer, but we were able to see what was going on because Shannon is experienced and very carefully removed this plastic outer layer. So definitely do not go cutting open your LiPo batteries. That's a really bad idea. But Shannon's an expert, so we had a bunch of battery failures, so we needed to see what was going on. So this is just for show. Do not try at home. But when batteries are exposed to moisture, or really any electronics are exposed to moisture, they will corrode, and then if this little piece disconnects from the metal piece that's up here, your battery is just going to fail. We've seen this usually in batteries that are out in the field for more than 2 years. So it doesn't happen often, but we had a lot of failures happen at one time and we had to see why. So there can be things going on under this plastic layer where in this case, you would have to just buy a new battery and have a new battery to replace because you can't fix when a battery fails like that. So that was the end of all of our common issues. I guess I'm just going to go through these last 2 slides and then we can get to questions. This was the purchase list that I was mentioning a few times throughout this presentation on wikiwatershed.org/DRWI, all those references, quick guides that Dave was going through in the beginning. There's a support supplies section, and that's where you can find this purchase list. Hopefully I didn't just break something. Let's see. Oh, okay. So we have links to all of these various helpful troubleshooting materials that are helpful to have on hand. There's micro SD memory cards and adapters. This is the links to the battery charger, or this is the little red. There were 3 separate pieces to the battery charger. So you have this charger circuit board, and then you have just a 5-volt wall adapter, and then your A to C cable. And then here are various vendors that you can get your battery from. And then we have suggested brushes for cleaning your sensor. And then we give recommendations for various handheld sensors. So if you ever need just suggestions of what would be helpful in your troubleshooting process, we have that there for you. Again, that's on the Wiki Watershed /DRWI page under support supplies. You can find that there. And then the very last thing was to reiterate this service request form that we're just implementing. So again, this is for DRWI support only, at least right now. We only have the funds to support the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. But let's see if I click on this, if it works. You go out to your station, you try all the things we just talked about, and it's still not working, and you're part of the DRWI, you would fill out this service request form. And we'll just briefly go through these questions. Your name, your organization, email address. Then you want to give a brief overview of what station you're at, because there are hundreds of stations out there, and we don't know how to help you if we don't know which station you're talking about. So you put in your site information, and then we walk you through this troubleshooting process through various questions. So the more information you can give us, the better we'll be able to assist you. The more we know what's going on, the better we'll have, the better chance we'll have of troubleshooting your issue. So you can just describe what's going on. If you went out to your, so if your station is transmitting, if it's live, have you gone out and visited the station? And then we remind you, if you did you fill out a visit data sheet? Did you turn the logger on and off? Retrieve the memory card? Does any of this sound familiar? All this stuff we just talked about. Retrieve the data file. If you did retrieve the data file, it's really helpful for Dave, Shannon, and I to have that file. If the data weren't live on Monitor My Watershed, it helps us to see the most recent data that were saved to the file. So if that's necessary, you can email us that file. And then the last known battery voltage. Then we have a few more questions here. Just if your sensor readings were out of whack, did you perform quality control? Did your quality control match up with your sensor readings? Then we ask you if your SIM card is active and funded. Literally everything we just talked about. It's kind of cool as a final review. And then we have, are there any LED lights lit on the Mayfly? What are the patterns, if so? And then we have one final space where you have the opportunity to say if there's anything visibly wrong, someone take a baseball bat to your station, I don't know. Anything that was going on that's you can see would be helpful to fill in here. So then you hit submit, and it'll send an email to Dave, Shannon, and I where we will be able to better help you. We created this because we get emails often of, hey, my sensor's broken or my station's broken. And this is just a more organized way for us to be able to keep track of what we're doing, but also keeping service requests organized moving forward. So I think that is it. That's all I have. So if there's any questions on, I guess first, maybe if we can take questions on the topics that we covered, get those out of the way first, and then we can take other questions about various topics that maybe we didn't cover if there's extra time.
That sounds like a good plan, Rachel. We are at 3:31 right now. So we've got about a half an hour. So great timing on your presentation. Shannon, are you back on? Shannon was having issues with her computer.
Yeah, I'm back on, and my
Okay.
so my computer decided to reboot itself in the middle of Rachel's talk. So I lost all of the because when you log back in, you don't see the chat messages that were previously there.
Okay.
So if anybody had anything in chat that I needed to answer in the last 10 minutes or so, let me know. I did have a question for, did Jesse just leave?
I think Jesse had to go, yes.
Okay, I wanted to mention him that we are actually sold out of those headphone jacks on our website. They're listed there, but they're not currently in stock. But and just in case, I guess most of you are with the DRWI group, so you aren't purchasing things on Amazon. But because we provide most of the repair parts as part of the grant, but if you do happen to look on Amazon and you're searching for any of our products, and if it's out of stock, Amazon just takes it off of the search results. So even if they just happen to be out of Mayflies for a week and you go to Amazon and you search EnviroDIY Mayfly, it'll say product not found. So we have a lot of people that are worried that we've removed our stuff and we're not selling them anymore. It's just that if Amazon doesn't have it in stock, they just remove it from the search results. So it doesn't mean that we're not selling them anymore. It just means that Amazon doesn't currently have them at the moment. So nothing to worry about there. I guess there was also a question about what battery voltage, battery packs and things like that, because as Rachel warned, do not connect any random battery pack to your Mayfly. One is the polarity, and number two is the voltage. That you can buy battery packs in all different combinations of 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cell, 10 cell, and they're all different voltages. And the Mayfly is only designed to take on those little, it's called a JST connector, a JST 2.0, which is 2 millimeter spacing on the pins. But that specific header that you connect the battery to on a Mayfly is not supposed to see anything more than about 4.3 volts, because the way the charging circuit is on there, it's expecting a lithium battery, and lithium only. You can't connect a nickel metal hydride or a NiCad or any other type of rechargeable. It's a lithium battery connected 3.7 nominal volts to that socket. So as long as you get the polarity right, there's a little plus and minus next to those battery jacks. And as long as you get the polarity right and it's a 3.7 volt battery pack, then you're good to go. If you have anything other than that, then you can't utilize the onboard charger, and you would need to connect it either to the USB jack. You can use any 5-volt power source connected to the micro USB socket on the Mayfly, or on the current board that we're selling now, the 0.5B version. There's two small pins up in the upper right hand corner, which is the external battery input. You can put anywhere from 4 to 12 volts to that connector, but you would have to supply your own external charger to whatever you had on there. So but yeah, if you find a lithium battery pack that's 3.7 volts nominal and you want to hook it up to your Mayfly, but the only difference is that the pins are swapped, then you can either cut the cables and then resolder them, or it's usually a little easier to take a small tool like a pair of tweezers or a very fine screwdriver, and you can actually bend the little plastic tabs on the battery connectors up and swap the pins around yourself. But you have to be very careful that when you're doing that, that you don't allow the bare pins after you've removed them from the header to touch each other, or you'll be shorting out a LiPo battery and could cause a really nice fire right there in front of you. So be extremely careful with that. So that's kind of why we recommend most people just purchase, if you're here in the US, and you can buy them from the suppliers we recommend. That's the safest way, because we've had a few too many people just go online and search for, you know, the lowest lithium battery they could find and plug it in, and then wonder why either the battery blew up, or the Mayfly got really hot and some smoke came out, or the Mayfly doesn't respond anymore, or something like that. So making sure that the polarity is right before you plug it in is extremely important. You're muted, Dave.
James, does that answer your question fully? Seems like it was pretty thorough.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, from my perspective, yeah, we can't get anything sent in from overseas. They just won't ship them across
Right.
here. And so I've got to find things locally. And I found a supplier of the Raspberry Pi battery packs for around about 30 New Zealand dollars. And that's exactly what I've been doing, is just cutting the ends off and then resoldering them. And seems to be working all right. But I was just sort of wondering if that's okay for the Mayfly in the long run.
Yep. Yeah. As long as you got the polarity right, and it's not, if you're using certain battery packs, you'll have to just make sure that you match up the charge rate. I think it's, I forget what it, I think there's some specs on our website about the charge rate of the specific charge controller. The new Mayfly board that will be coming out soon actually has a completely different charger circuit and different charge rates and a bunch of options. So my mind is kind of tuned to those specs right now, so I don't want to say what the current one is, but yeah, just double check that that your charge rate and voltages and that of whatever battery pack you use match up with the with what the Mayfly says. And with any questions regarding Mayflies and circuit boards and our accessories and all that, people can ask questions anytime on our forum, because that's a great place to, if we answer the question there, then hopefully it adds to our knowledge base, so folks can see those related questions in the future if they have a same sort of question. So that's a great place to ask there if anybody has any technical questions after the workshop.
Great. So Shannon, I don't know if you noticed or not, but Jesse is back on. So I don't know if you want to just.
Oh yeah, Jesse, real quick, I wanted to mention to you that while we were on our break, I went and looked at our EnviroDIY shop page, and the screw terminals and headphone jacks are both listed as not currently in stock on that site. So I'll have to double check our inventory to see if we have any. I know we'll be getting more in next month, but if I have any more, I'll see if I can list them in the next few days, but we may just be out of them right now because we had a lot of orders that we put out, and also a lot of stations we built in the last few months. So I'm not sure if we do have them right at the moment, but we will be getting some more soon. So.
Well, I guess our water quality will go to hell then until you guys got it up and running. But
exactly. Yep.
No, I did have one other question though, and I've been stumped, and I think I've emailed this. And I'm still trying to figure it out. But every time I run to try and get my clock synced up on the Arduino, it gives me a 5-hour difference.
Yeah, so that was something that Dave mentioned earlier. If you're looking at are you talking about the 5-hour difference between what the clock says on your computer or on the data file or on Monitor My Watershed, or?
Yeah, when I open up the data file, it gives me a difference. Yeah.
So the data files themselves, I believe, store the data in local time, but the website stores the data in UTC time, which is 5 hours ahead of Eastern Daylight Time. So most of us, except for James, are in the Eastern. Well, I guess there was a few other folks on there's somebody from Oregon, I think, that had registered. I'm not sure if they're online. But anybody here in the Eastern US, we are 5 hours behind UTC time. So there will always be a 5-hour difference between what is stored on the card, or excuse me, what is shown on the website and what is shown on like your cell phone during 5-6 months of the year when we're in standard time. But during daylight savings time, we jump ahead an hour. So now we are 4 hours, because now instead of being 5 hours behind UTC, we're 4 hours behind UTC because we've moved ahead an hour. So so right now it's 3:40 in the afternoon. So it's that would be what, 15:40 local time, but because we've jumped ahead, it's actually 14:40. But then you got to add 5 hours to get you to 19:40. So it'd be 19:40 UTC or 14:40 local time.
So are you saying like when I program it then just to make that modification if I want my data to come out?
we always program the onboard clock in UTC time. If you don't do that, you can go into your sketch. There should be a line somewhere in about the top 20 or 30 lines of the sketch. If you're using one of our sample sketches, it will say logger time zone, and it says -5 right there. And so what that does is it says that's the offset between what your clock says and where you are in the world. So if you were in England right now, you could say 0 for that, and then your clock and UTC would match up and everything would be great. But it's the only reason this is a real issue is when we first started deploying loggers, we didn't have to worry about that. And we used to always program our loggers in local time. And that was great for us because everything was matched up, everything was simple. But then when we started deploying loggers in other places in the country, and then we started putting some over on the other side of the world, it got more complicated because we started streaming data to a website, and we need everyone's data that goes to Monitor My Watershed to be reported in UTC time so that we know when it came through. Because if everybody's just reporting their data in their local time zone without telling us where they are, then all of a sudden it's very hard to match the data with the correct time. So
That makes sense.
Yeah, so we recommend people program their clock 5 or 4 hours ahead of time based on whether it's daylight savings time or not. And then it goes that way. So if you have a logger that has a cell board on it or a Wi-Fi board, like some of the ones we've done, the sketch actually goes online and connects to a time server and sets the clock for you. And then it'll program the time. So you don't have to do that step yourself. But I believe your stations are not online. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So for yours, yeah, it only knows the time if you tell it what it is. So yeah, so if you want to make your data files match up properly with the website and everything else, then yeah, I would program them with UTC time. And you can, the easiest way is you go online and say, just go to Google and say, what time is it? It'll take you to time.gov, which is the government's time server. And it shows you the time zones of everywhere in the world, or everywhere in the country. So it'll give you all the Eastern time and Pacific time, Mountain time, and all that. And then over in the upper right-hand corner, there's a handy box that says UTC time, and it gives you what the current UTC, which stands for Universal Coordinated Time, or GMT is another way people call it that. So that is the easiest place to find the GMT time or UTC time when you're setting your logger clock. And so I usually just go to time.gov, look at that time, and then use that for programming my clock. And again, I only do that for the ones that don't have a cell board. If they do have a cell board on it, then you can kind of do it the lazy way of put your logger out there, and then when you first boot it up, it connects to the time server and it says, okay, my onboard clock says it's this, but the time server says, here's the real time. I'm going to set the clock, and then from then on, everything is synchronized. So that's a quicker, easy way to do it once you've got a cell board on there.
Okay, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yep.
Great. All right, we've got 15 minutes. Just a few things from the chat. Kim is mentioning, I wonder if using a baffle similar to the snake guards used on Eastern bluebird nest box poles would help protect an EnviroDIY station from nibbling critters. I'm not familiar with a baffle.
You're talking about like an upside down funnel kind of a thing? Like what you put on a squirrel feeder to keep squirrels from climbing the box?
Oh, that was she's.
I'm guessing maybe that's what they were thinking. Which, yeah, that would keep them out of the box. But most of the time, the animals they don't chew too much right on the box itself. They chew on the cable on the ground, especially in the winter when the mice make their little tunnels through the snow. You'll actually uncover some snow and find that they made a nest right on top of the cables. Jim, I guess Jim Moore is still not, he's not in here still. He had we think a squirrel that was chewing the solar panel cable on his just because there was a tree somewhere. It was kind of a tree beside the station. So we think one either climbed the pole or just kind of jumped over from the tree and chewed on his solar cable. So animals seem to find a way to your box no matter what. And Jim's had several beavers actually eat right through his cables in multiple places. So he's had an ongoing rodent issue with a number of his stations and has gotten pretty creative with trying to come up with different types of pipes and conduit and ways of routing the cable. And I think he's done pretty good lately. I don't think he's had a major animal issue in the last little bit, but I think every site kind of has its own challenges that we've had to deal with one type of critter or another. And we've had some that just have teenagers that like to hit things with machetes. So, that one of our station owners actually put out a trail cam to take videos and photos because their station kept getting vandalized, and they got pictures of kids walking around with a machete and throwing rocks and hitting things. So it's always a challenge to see what kind of things are going to happen. But we really hope that the new CTD cables that are black will attract less attention because they'll blend in better and also be a little hardier and not get damaged as much from those little, hopefully just the mild animal chews will not destroy the cables like they do now. So we're really hoping that's going to be a big improvement there.
Good. Let's see. Adam, was my response in the chat suitable for you, or should we talk more about your situation?
So for my purposes, yes. Jan might have follow-up information that she wanted to ask.
Okay.
But I realized coming into this, I probably needed a little more information from her to determine what exactly she wanted from that answer. So I just sent her an email about that, and we'll let you know.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank
no
you, though.
problem.
That did help.
We can chat again as needed. Feel free to be in touch.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Anything more in the chat here? It looks like we are good. James, any other questions about rating curves or anything else that you had? You had a couple different things in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if they'll be able to be answered because our hydro team kind of struggles with it as well. The catchment that I'm looking at deploying a whole lot of these Mayfly sites in the lower reaches has a whole lot of soft sort of volcanic sediment on the bottom of the streams, and I've been informed that developing a rating curve is actually quite difficult there. And yeah, I was just wondering if anyone's got any sort of advice on that kind of stuff, how they've worked through similar sort of situations with the Mayfly.
What's been the challenge with the rating curve? Has it been the hydrologic rating curve, the depth to discharge curve, or the turbidity ESS curve?
Yeah, the depth to discharge. So the cross section just changes when you're getting those big floods coming through.
Oh.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if that cross section is changing with every big flow, that is going to be pretty tough. And so you're doing some sort of prediction of flow based on the cross section measurements?
Yeah, that would be the idea, to use a whole lot of spot gaugings and then relate that to the water level sensor that we've got as part of the Mayfly, and to develop a proxy for flow, and use that for further sort of predictions and for nutrient species and that kind of stuff. Yeah,
and you're not able to, it's high enough flow that you can't actually do physical measurements of the flow. Is that correct? Yeah. And it's about just understanding, because we can't get out there enough to really understand the variability that's going on. So that's where the water level sensor comes in. It's just got us scratching our heads a little bit. I have been looking and found some good control structures in terms of culverts and things like that may be able to help us with it. But yeah, it's still.
We had an issue at Stroud where we ended up just putting large landscape pavers. They're like these basically large bricks that are maybe 30 to maybe 30 centimeters by maybe 30 by 30 by 100, something like that. They're very, very, very large. And we went in during a really low flow time of the year and kind of embedded them in the stream bed and then up the stream banks itself. And so it's basically like a giant, not quite a V-notch weir, but just a control structure that keeps the bed from moving at all, and also kind of stabilizes the stream banks also. So and we were able to just put them in, and they settled themselves in after a few small storms and all, and they've been in for probably 6-7 years now and haven't moved. If your bed is really that unstable, you might need even larger stones or trees or something. I don't know what sort of permits you would need or equipment or whatever, but I have seen areas where people have done, major stream side or stream bank stabilization projects and have put, large trees embedded in a bank, and they've been able to do stuff that helps stabilize the channel to prevent erosions and large floods and all that. But that's, this kind of outside the range of what most smaller groups would do if they're just kind of doing passive monitoring to get in and actually kind of change the stream bed around. But yeah, if your stream bed is constantly moving a lot, then like if you were to, I guess I would suggest doing a handful of, some sort of cross-sectional measurements if you need to do weighting measurements or in a boat or something, and see if it's just changing by 5 or 10% at the most over the course of lots of floods, then it's maybe not an issue. But if your cross section is really changing that drastically, then you might have to come up with some way to stabilize it. But it may be one of those that if things keep moving, but it's still, if the stream gets wider, but it also gets shallower, then the overall cross section may be still the same, as long as the slope is still the same. And there's lots of different ways to do that. There are some great ADCP, which is an acoustic Doppler current profilers that you can buy to put under the water, either in the center of the channel or off on the side, that basically send a sound wave off into the water at various angles and can calculate the flow of the particles and can do cross-sectional measurements. And we've actually got a handful of different models here at Stroud that we've used over the years. Most of the ones we have are mounted at the very center in the bottom of the stream channel. It's an upward looking acoustic Doppler current profiler, and they work really nice, but they're anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 US for each one of them. And so, and they get mounted to the stream bottom. And if your stream bed is really that unstable, then you're at risk of actually losing your instrumentation too. So you've got kind of your own set of interesting challenges there that, yeah, it would be a kind of a neat challenge to implement some instrumentation there. But yeah, it's something very different than what we normally do with our stations here.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that. I think I have considered putting in sort of rocks and things like that in the structure in the stream bed as well. So yeah, maybe I'll look along those lines.
Yep. And I see a question from Gustavo about his Mayfly. Is he still on the call? Looks like, yeah. If you do happen to blow out one of the LEDs or a few of the other parts on the Mayfly, if you've got a really steady hand and a really fine tipped soldering iron and maybe a magnifying glass or some really good glasses to see what you're doing, it is possible to replace individual components on the board. Some of the small LEDs and other parts are only 10 or 15 cents if you need a replacement for them. So if you want to attempt that, I can give you a part number for a green LED with a 0603 package that you could unsolder the old one and put a new one on. So if that's all you need to do, then I can give you some info on that. But it's not for the faint of heart or somebody with a jittery hand or with a really fat tipped soldering iron. But if you've got the right tools and equipment and all, I've replaced stuff even smaller than that LED on a regular basis, but I've been doing this for a very long time and have all the right equipment. But it is possible to salvage your board if it's just the green LED.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good. All right. Well, we're having people trickle out of the Zoom room. So I guess if any more questions from anyone?
Yeah. Hi, this is Kim. I do have a question for Shannon probably, but it's probably going to be very specific just to my situation, so I didn't want to waste anybody else's time.
Well,
But
we're still in the time frame, so go for it, Kim.
hi, thank you. First off, I'd like to give you guys kudos for all you've done to the website since you first started this project many years ago. I keep checking in every once in a while, and it's mind-boggling how much more resources there are available to people if you want to try it. So I just wanted to let you know that it's awesome all you're doing to help everybody else. So thank you. My specific question is, Meter was kind enough to donate a Ctd sensor to me back right after I took your workshop in October a few years ago. And but they gave it to me with a pigtail on the end, just the bare wires on the end.
Yep.
And that's my only roadblock to being able to set up my station. What do I need to buy on Amazon to be able to connect this bare wire sensor to the I think it's the headphone jack? Is it a simple fix that I can do myself?
Yeah, so that's something to mention to anybody else here. If you happen to be buying a Meter Group sensor, Meter Group is the only company in the world that I know of that uses headphone jacks on the ends of their cables. Like every other company uses bare wires so that people can hook it to an infinite number of loggers or other devices that they want to hook it up to. But Meter Group makes their own like data loggers, and they try to make it super easy for people. So they just use headphone jacks so that you can just plug it right in and go, and you don't need to match up wire colors and all that kind of stuff. So if you call up Meter Group today and say, hey, I want to order a sensor and I want a CTD, they'll say, okay, here you go. And they'll sell you one. And when it arrives, it will have bare wires on it. Especially if you say that you're using it with a non-Meter Group data logger, because for every other data logger in the world, you're going to need bare wires. So they don't want to sell you a headphone jack sensor for a logger that needs bare wires. So what I did was invent that little board that we have two different boards that we had been selling over the last few years. One is the headphone jack board, and then the other one is a screw terminal board that allows you to connect bare wires to a Mayfly. Or the other one is the headphone jack that connects to the Mayfly. So the problem is I'm just out of both of those right now, and those I'm in the process of redesigning both of those to incorporate some new changes that we're in designing into all of them to be able to accommodate all of the new sensors, like the new generation 2 CTD that's coming out, and also the new turbidity sensors that are coming. So I'm in the process of getting those new boards in. So if you can wait just a little bit, I can send you one of the newer ones when they're ready in maybe a month or so. If you need ones shorter than that, I can send you an email, and we've got just a couple left over, but we don't have enough that we've got them currently listed anywhere. But if you just need one, we could probably get you one sooner. But yeah, it's a good thing to mention for anybody else, though, that if you're attempting to order your own CTD sensor from Meter Group, that you should ask for. It's not a problem to get the bare wires. We just say if you use the headphone jack, that makes it just plug and play. It's a lot easier to use. But the default configuration from the company is to send you one with bare wires. But yeah, I can send you an email with some information about some options for you in the meantime. But yeah, hopefully starting next month, we're going to have a whole bunch of either blog posts or posts on the forum. I don't know, we may not send out emails to everybody, but there will be a lot of information about all the new accessories and products and things as they come out in the next couple of months, with the new cellular board that we're coming out with to replace the current one, and all these new adapters, and also a newer version of the Mayfly that has a whole bunch of new and exciting changes on it. So we'll be telling everybody more about that as we get closer. But for right now, yeah, anybody who has questions about that kind of stuff can just send me an email.
Can I just add something regarding the stereo board, because we can't get those here in New Zealand either. But what I've managed to do, I don't know if you can see that, we can get these little connectors here,
right?
And I've just cut a Grove cable and soldered that on, and it works perfectly.
Yep.
Thank you.
Cool. Great.
Sorry, I do have one other question. Do you know if anybody has ever tried to hook up a trail cam to the Mayfly and have that data sent somehow, or is the data logger just meant for collecting data and the trail cam would have to be a separate entity?
Yeah, there's not really an easy way. I've built my own cameras in the past, and if you had access to the certain data and the certain circuitry inside the camera, you could probably come up with a way to do it. I know there's people who've done it with a Raspberry Pi, which is a way more smarter computer board than what a Mayfly is, but has its own sort of set of challenges and uses a lot more power and all this kind of stuff. But as for the Mayfly is really designed to be a sleeping logger that just deals with a few small sensors and transmits them. So there's not an easy way to send the data that way. There are every time I go online, I find cheaper and cheaper commercial products that are doing things that used to be very expensive to do, and there are some fairly inexpensive cellular trail cams now that would just be a standalone option that you could just put a SIM card in and transmit the data. You know, they usually go through that company's website and all that. So that's the thing. It would be extremely difficult and expensive and complicated for us to incorporate photos into the Monitor My Watershed website and all of the software and things that we've written. So it's just easier to offload that kind of thing to some other third party to use one of their products instead of ours.
That makes sense. Thank you for all you do for us.
Yep, no problem.
Okay, we are at 4:01. Any other pressing questions? Right. Thanks to everyone for attending. Didn't even get to say thanks to everyone because people have just been trickling out, but nice to see some new faces. And this is recorded. It'll be posted on that wiki/DRWI page in the next day or two. So feel free to reference that. And feel free to be in touch as needed with any of the Stroud facilitators today. So I guess we are good. Anything from Rachel or Shannon before we sign off?
No, thank you guys so much. And thanks for hanging on to the end of the workshop. I know it was a kind of long one, so thanks for still being here. Appreciate your willingness to learn.
I just want to say thank you. You answered so many questions that I've had, and I know I'll be using this video over and over when you can teach others and also when I have a question about what's going on. So I thought it was really useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Great feedback.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your week.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Well, how'd you think it went?
You should stop the recording too.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. Stopping recording now.